Hello everyone. Thank you for having me in Barcelona, Urban Futures, Cultural Past, Sustainable Cities, Cultures and Crafts. I'm Maria Christodoulou, and my paper is titled Two Cities in the Making, Segregation in Old Nicosia, 1963-1968. The 1965 film Cyprus reveals the island's contrasts and contradictions. A man riding a horse cart passes by a modern tall building, probably a hotel, while another walking with his camel alongside a newly constructed road is overtaken by an automobile. Between 1963 and 1968, Nicosia was an amalgamation of contrasts. One could wander the city without witnessing any signs of violence or civil war as easily as one could take a wrong turn and be confronted by men with machine guns. The boldest of contrasts, though, was the fact that the circular Venetian walls that contained Nicosia and the dividing line were transforming from a closed entity in the center of the island into an uncertain space at the edges of two separate entity cities, communities, and worlds. Although the Turkish Cypriots started forming the Nicosia enclave as early as 1956, the second half of the 1960s sealed their self-exclusion from the Republic of Cyprus and what was left of the Cyprus government and nearly all commons and public life outside their enclaves. Immediately after the December 1963 clashes, the Turks set out to establish a country of their own, while the Greek Cypriots set out to upgrade the now only Greek Republic of Cyprus. Residing just half a block apart, two communities were constructing their very own Nicosias. Fran Tonkis argues that seeking and or finding refuge in community and or territoriality is sensible when spaces and or people are potentially threatening. However, she and Iris Marion Young assert that this turn to community is also a disavowal of the city as a space of difference. The affirmation of sameness, the desire for immediacy, the premium placed on face-to-face interaction, the craving for mutuality, all appear in some sense anti-urban. Therefore, if one was to agree with Henry Lefebvre that the urban can be defined as a place where differences know one another and through their mutual recognition test one another, and in this way they are strengthened or weakened, one would probably find that Nicosia was evolving to be an anti-urban city dominated by contrast and contradictions. Each time President Makarios announced pacification measures, such as the removal of certain Greek Cypriot armed posts, fortifications, or police checkpoints for the Turkish Cypriots, Radio Bayrak, the voice of the Turkish Cypriot fighters, interpreted his moves as nothing but attempts to realize the abolition of the Green Line. According to the Turks, the Green Line was the most emphatic proof of the de facto partition of Cyprus, and its abolition would be tantamount to bidding farewell forever both to partition and federation. This permanent stance was indicative of the Turkish Cypriot leadership's exploitation of the division towards the realization of a separate entity. On the other side of the divide, despite their pacification measures, the Greek Cypriot leadership's actions were not quite inviting either. They clearly indicated a reluctance towards the possibility of a renewed political cooperation with Turkish Cypriots. In December 1965, exactly 2 years after the breakdown of the Republic, the House of Representatives, with only its Greek Cypriot members participating in the quorum, as the Turkish Cypriots members had withdrawn in 1963, passed two government bills. One extended the 5-year life of the House for a further year. The other amended the electoral law to abolish separate Greek and Turkish representation in any future election. The new electoral law essentially regarded the two Cypriot communities as integrated and equal. In theory, any Turk could be nominated for any of the 50 seats in parliament, and the legislature could consist of 50 Turks and no Greeks at all. In practice, though, the application of the new law was much more likely to result in a parliament consisting of 48 or 49 Greeks and 1 or 2 Turks. This process of slicing away the Turkish Cypriot constitutional authority resulted in a de facto Greek Cypriot majority rule, which was virtually unimpeded by the Turkish Cypriots. When the 15 Turkish Cypriot delegates expressed their will to attend the meeting for the first time since their withdrawal in 1963, Galafkos Kliridis, the Greek Cypriot president of the House of Representatives, informed them that they would only be allowed attendance if they recognized the current Cyprus government and all the legislation passed in their absence, which they did not. Since 1963, the Turks had been running their own affairs in Nicosia and other Turkish enclaves on an unofficial basis via the General Committee, which was established in 1964 on an ad hoc basis. The legal framework for the operation of this committee was the 1960 Constitution and all the decrees and laws issued by the Turkish Cypriot administration after 1963. However, following the December 1965 developments just described, the Turks took a number of steps which further enhanced the division of administrative structures between Greeks and Turks. They first provided their own law electing the Turkish Cypriot Communal Chamber, which then also assumed a legislative character. According to the 1960 constitution, the communal chambers were two parallel legislative bodies, one for the Greek and one for the Turkish Cypriot communities, with authority and legislative power over their communities' religious and educational matters, and to some extent the jurisdiction of courts. Members of the Turkish Cypriot Communal Chamber, along with the Turkish Cypriot elected members of the now abolished Republic of Cyprus Parliament, formed a quasi-parliament issuing official legislation for the enclaves. To consolidate and strengthen economic viability of the Turkish Cypriot community and for currency to be circulated within the community only, the Turkish leadership announced the taxes payable to the Republic by members of the Turkish community under the personal taxes law would from then on be assessed and collected by the finance department of the Turkish Cypriot Communal Chamber, which had become the main economic authority responsible for the collection and management of the General Committee's funds. The committee had also imposed its own custom duties on several products entering the enclaves. These moves confronted the Greek Cypriots with the spectre of a self-sufficient separate administration flourishing beyond the barricades of the Green Line. While the Turkish Cypriot Communal Chamber was upgraded to an official organ of the Turkish Cypriot state, the Greek Cypriot Communal Chamber was abolished in 1965, with its educational and cultural authorities transferred to the newly and constitutionally illegal established Ministry of Education of the Republic of Cyprus. The absence of such a ministry from the 1960 constitution meant that the official bi-communal state was left out of educational matters, which laid in the hands of either community's communal chamber. From 1965, however, education provided by the Republic of Cyprus was to be identified with the state. Both would now be solemnly Greek. Consequently, both communities had been taking steps towards consolidating their legitimacy in either side of the Green Line. Administration-wise, the situation in the Nicosia enclave was structured in a new kind of order for the Turkish Cypriots. However, the conditions prevailing in the Turkish quarter of the capital formed a grimmer reality. On entering the enclave, a person was greeted by two large signs that read, "Welcome to the Turkish sector, the economically blockaded area," and another, "Road out of order, no cement or asphalt for the Turks." Due to lack of asphalt, roads were potholed, broken, and reduced to dust in main places. Vital services such as the post, telephone, electricity, and water also posed several anomalies to the function of the enclave as a self-sustained entity. Various services and national assets of value like the Cyprus Telecommunications Authority and Water Development Department were now situated within the buffer zone between fortified posts of the opposing sides. They had suffered considerable damage with their content, equipment, and machinery looted and offices and records left in disorder. These services were no longer able to function and therefore serve the city. Due to the situation which affected Turks the most, the government's embargo and also the Turks' very policy of isolation, there was no proper telephone communication or postal services between the Turkish Cypriot central authorities in Nicosia and all the other enclaves and villages scattered around Cyprus. Letters were postmarked with a Cyprus-Turkish post office stamp, yet they could not be delivered outside the enclave. The central post office, like the central telephone switchboard, was in the Greek sector. Gasoline was also scarce, and as the press reported, a black market has grown up, but even by this method, the Turks are usually able to get only 2 gallons at a time from gas stations run by the Greeks. This observation is proof that at least a residual cross-communication network of economic contacts continue to exist, however much against the grain of other tendencies. Nevertheless, the Turks kept strengthening fortifications and erecting new roadblocks in their side of the city on the pretext of affording greater security to families being moved in from tented camps to empty houses on the Green Line along the north side, just meters away from the opposing gun posts. Houses along the Green Line had been kept empty by the United Nations peacekeeping force in Cyprus in order not to upset a precarious balance, as they were often damaged by the removal of materials that could be used for the repair of houses in the Turkish sector. As increasing numbers of displaced Turkish Cypriots reached the enclave from early 1964 onwards, the Turkish authorities had to secure housing, clothing, and food supplies in an already crowded quarter, where every bit of space was utilized. In December 1967, more than 40,000 Turkish Cypriots resided in the Nicosia enclave, with about 2/3 of them in need of welfare services. Many houses in the Turkish quarter of Nicosia were dilapidated and falling apart. The shells of half-built concrete buildings stood empty and abandoned. The ones that had been built since the fighting began were constructed with mud bricks, straw, and small bits of plaster applied around the windows and doors. Because of the lack of wiring, none of them had electricity. Many of the displaced Turks had settled with relatives. More than 3 families, often totaling more than 20 persons, lived in a single overcrowded room. Some people slept on the floor, others in simple iron beds. The less fortunate settled in raft-donated tents, high enough to walk through, provided one avoided the central pole and the various objects hanging from it, and hastily built aluminum houses. The least fortunate resided in overcrowded camps, schools, and mosques. The Ataturk Elementary School, for example, became home to 650 people. Women did their laundry in open tubs and cooked over open fires or little kerosene stoves in the same room in which clotheslines were crossing over. Remaining without adequate housing and sanitation resulted in epidemics such as diphtheria. Most of their food and other supplies were brought in daily from the Turkish villages forming their own tiny enclaves around the island, or were provided to them by the Red Crescent, a Turkish relief organization. According to a 1966 CIA report, a Turkish foreign ministry official stated after a recent trip to the island that the Turkish Cypriots suffer more from psychological problems than from economic privation, as most of them lead a difficult existence, and it must be especially frustrating seeing the Greek Cypriots enjoying a relatively normal, prosperous life, while they depend on the $11 million annual help of Turkey. The years of economic siege by the Greeks widened the gap in living standards between the two communities. Turkish Cypriot incomes fell from an average that was 20% lower than the per capita income of the Greek Cypriots in 1961 to one that was 50% lower in 1971. Economic integration would clearly have benefited most Turks as individuals, but this could not be allowed to happen at the cost of the community's political goals. Indeed, the Greek sector of Nicosia seemed to prosper and flourish. The Greek Cyprus economy did look rosy, but apart from the enclave problem and the Greek land and properties in them, too much of the government's revenue came from the British bases and the well-paid UN troops, which essentially and ironically monitored the stability of division. Since the declaration of independence in 1960 and until November 1965, the Republic of Cyprus had received a total of about £25 million from external funds. This money, managed only by Greeks after the Turks had withdrawn from government, was used to strengthen its budget and maintain various services. It enabled the transfer of increased amounts to the development fund, which were used for the implementation of the 5-year development plans, the construction of new modern buildings and installations at Nicosia Airport, the Nicosia-Famagusta Road, execution of water and irrigation projects, expansion of the island's electricity network, the construction of school buildings, harbors, and dams, the completion of a geological survey of the island, and the establishment of the Agricultural Research Institute and the Productivity Center, all between 1960 and 1967. Within this framework, the Greek municipality of Nicosia signed various agreements with private enterprises for all sorts of projects to be carried out in the Greek sector of the capital. Sewage and sewage disposal, refuse disposal, the construction of a central wholesale market, the drainage scheme for the area, an up-to-date slaughterhouse, a housing scheme, a swimming pool, the resurfacing of all streets within the walls and of streets of primary importance outside the walls, along with the widening and improving of the outer ring road, parking facilities for cars and buses, a livestock market, construction of public conveniences, the improvement of the public garden and the gardens in the moat, the construction of bridges, the development of certain municipal properties on a commercial basis, the improvement of the existing municipal baths, and construction of a new unit, as well as the extension and renovation of the municipal theater. Capital donated prior to 1963 division and intended for both communities was exploited only by one at this point, the Greek official government and its half of the city. The fact that at the 1967 speech on the industrial development of Cyprus by Greek Cypriot Minister of Commerce and Industry Andreas Araouzos, there was no reference to the Turkish Cypriots whatsoever, is telling of the increasing assurance and self-confidence regarding the future. It also reflects Amit and Iftahel's argument about the permanent temporariness. of grey spaces, in this case the enclave. Its existence produced new socio-political relations in the divided city, often leading to the darkening of disempowered populations, involving attempts to economically and physically exclude them, and at the same time to the laundering of empowered populations, which thereby enhanced their legal and economic status even further. The Greek side of Nicosia had achieved its own Hilton in February 1967, sprouted new and expensive restaurants, and even the church extended the already palatial archbishopric in the old city with a new, larger cathedral. In 1969, the mayor of Nicosia, Odysseas Ioannidis, stated that the city was a historic town and, like all historic towns, has its own behavior and personality. In this respect, Nicosia shows the ability to adjust quickly to each new era of history and meet challenges of the times, apparently meaning the imperatives of modernization. While the Greek sector of Nicosia, Old Town, was transforming into a metropolis with 12 blocks of flats and wide streets, a number of problems emerged. Traffic is probably the most important to look at, as it is quite telling of the mobility in the city's Greek quarter, but also its division. Municipal correspondence reveals that traffic was so heavy it resulted in the wear and tear of streets. To deal with this situation, the municipality prohibited vehicles from parking in certain streets within the walls and indicated allocated parking spaces outside the walls. People were also advised to avoid moving by car within the city and move around as little as possible as precautionary measures to facilitate the work of the civil defense in the case of clashes. Yet one of the reasons for the heavy traffic was that many people deemed it safer to move by car in order to be out of trouble quicker. A reminder that their everyday could at any time become violent. Besides, the guns did go off nearly every night. In December 1967, the Turkish Cypriot General Committee was upgraded to the Turkish Cypriot Provisional Administration, providing 19 basic laws covering legislative, executive, and judicial fields, while at the same time denying it was forming a state within a state. The Turks declared that the administration would function until such time as the provisions of the 1960 constitution were applied, but were reluctant to discuss anything but partition or federation. Even if the Turkish position had been sincere, the 1960 constitution had been extensively revised by President Makarios, who was also unwilling to reverse any of the amendments made. These developments meant that the two separate cities within the walls of Nicosia, which had been emerging and developing since 1963, were only being solidified. Political leaders and elites perpetuated this situation, keeping people apart, with all implications this had on everyday life. In January 1968, in an effort to relax the situation, President Makarios announced his reconciliation policy with several pacification measures. The economic restrictions were lifted and roadblock checks on Turkish Cypriots everywhere on the island, except in the Turkish Cypriot enclaves of Nicosia, were abolished. The enclave remained under siege, as according to Makarios, it was the base of the Turkish Cypriot Provisional Administration, which the government did not wish to see succeeding in its unlawful activities. Officials and members of the administration were thus not allowed to enter or leave the enclave as a necessary measure to restrain its activities, which are calculated to undermine the unity of the state. There was really no response to Makarios' reconciliation policy in Nicosia, as the Turks kept to their enclave and prevented Greeks from entering. The only way for Greeks to pass through the enclave was in UN convoys, twice a day in each direction. At the checkpoints, they were thoroughly searched by the Turkish Cypriot enclave authorities and greeted by road signs welcoming them to the free Turkish territory. In March 1968, after intense international initiatives and consultations, the two communities' leaders decided to participate in intercommunal talks about the Cyprus problem. In a spirit of cooperation and goodwill, President Makarios also lifted the roadblocks at Nicosia, Famagousta and Ledra Palace, previously sustained, and removed police from the streets, letting Turkish Cypriot pedestrians free to circulate without any checks. It became possible for the first time since 1963 to drive all around the Venetian walls encircling Nicosia, passing through both Greek and Turkish sectors without being detained for police checks. Nevertheless, Greek Cypriots were still forbidden in the Turkish enclave without very specific reasons, such as a job pass. Turkish Cypriots themselves were not allowed outside their state of exception without a special pass from their authorities. The majority was also not too eager to cross into the Greek quarter unless it was for business. Rebecca Bryan and Meta Hatay argue that isolation produced a certain form of enjoyment, as the state of exception had made possible a world apart and self-contained. one in which a Turkish culture flourished and Turkish Cypriots could pretend as if they had a state. This simulacrum of sovereignty maintained a semblance of reality that was challenged only when the barricades were lifted, only when Turkish Cypriots could emerge to find that the place they were living in was not a state, but in fact a camp. It was an heterotopia in which people experienced real suffering and their lives were transformed but eventually normalized as they developed social structures and hierarchies and engaged in political participation and other everyday practices. Tonki suggests that in framing community, the spatial and the social are continually overlaid as if particular spaces might produce definite social ties or vice versa. The enclaves were spaces that produced a certain political activity against the other community, and the Turkish Cypriots had worked with great hardship to establish a functioning administration with civil servants, schools, courts, postage, and other administrative functions with more than half of the working population, about 11,000 people, devoting their livelihood to military activities such as guarding the barricades and fortification works, which to them became essentially safety borders. They had achieved the desired de facto partition, which would be lost if they accepted to participate in an official government affair and in any kind of reciprocal activity. They consolidated their policy of enforced separation by remaining in their open-air prison and ruled out the normalization that President Magarios seemed to be offering, except he was not. In the context of the above, Magarios had also announced the master plan of government offices in Nicosia as part of the second 5-year development plan. All the ministries, government services, and departments would be housed in a single complex. As many colonial laws and administrative practices were still in force, and colonial buildings housed many of the Republic's administration and services, this complex would serve as the manifestation of the desire for decolonization and the creation of a modern nation state. It would realize the vision of a single unified modern administration serving centralization and efficiency. The site chosen to erect this complex was that of the old colonial secretariat. This all-inclusive unitary state would be reborn out on the ruins of colonialism. This idea was socially and ideologically oriented to overcome conflict and give birth to a new unified whole, something that the ordinary Greek and Turkish Cypriot could hopefully identify with. This building program excluded the office of the Turkish vice president from the list of services to be located in the new administrative complex. The office of Dr. Küçük had remained empty since 1964, and the development committee described it as now non-existent. Thus, for all the government's desire to overcome trends of separation and isolation and promote the unity of the state, the brief ironically excluded the office of the top Turkish Cypriot official. This development sealed, in a sense, the fact that while Nicosia was simultaneously situated in both sides of the partition, which had by then become very real, not only visually by the border, but also both in terms of administrative and governmental city structures and everyday standards and modes of living. The official government's actions indicated a refusal to acknowledge the fact that a Turkish Cypriot city or even state within a city was evolving in Nicosia. Magarios' surreptitious creation of a new constitution embodying his main objectives and Küçük's illegal quasi-state ignored the other in pursuit of the illusion of orderly rational government. The passage of time and prolongation of the unresolved situation in what had become a suspended civil war only favored the establishment of two distinct de facto entities and realities interfering with the Pax Urbana.